You watch them grow all season. Green, healthy, full of promise. Then one morning you see it, that dark, sunken patch spreading across the bottom of your tomatoes, blossom end rot. And almost every grower blames the soil, but the soil is not your real problem. Your watering pattern is welcome to Plant ER Lab, where smart growers discover plant ideas that actually make sense. If you have ever treated your tomatoes with calcium spray, added eggshells to your soil, or bought a special calcium fertilizer, and the blossom end rot still came back, this video will explain exactly why. The calcium in your soil is probably not the problem. The problem is whether that calcium is actually reaching your fruit. And that comes down to one thing most growers never think about. We will get to the exact reason in a few minutes. But first, if practical growing knowledge like this is useful to you, subscribe to Plant ER Lab now so you never miss an idea that actually helps. Here is the assumption most growers carry into tomato season. They see blossom end rot and they immediately think, my soil is missing calcium. So they add crushed eggshells, calcium spray on the leaves, dolomite lime, a calcium magnesium supplement. They treat the soil as if it is the problem. And in some cases, the soil genuinely is low in calcium. But those cases are actually not common. Most garden soils, most bagged potting mixes, and most raised bed soils already contain usable calcium. The problem is rarely that the calcium is absent. The problem is that the plant cannot move it to where it needs to go. And this is the shift in thinking that changes everything. Blossom end rot is technically described as a calcium deficiency in the fruit tissue. But calling it a deficiency makes most growers look at the soil when they should be looking at their hose. Because calcium does not travel through a tomato plant on its own. It travels with water. And if your water delivery is inconsistent, calcium delivery to the fruit becomes inconsistent. That is the hidden driver almost no one talks about. To understand why watering is the real issue, you need a basic picture of how calcium moves inside a tomato plant. Calcium is what plant scientists call a flow-immobile nutrient. This is a technical phrase, but what it means in practical terms is simple. Calcium cannot be redistributed once it lands somewhere in the plant. It moves through the xylem, the plant's water transport system, from the roots upward, carried by the flow of water and dissolved minerals. Once it is deposited in a leaf or a stem, it stays there. The plant cannot pull it back out and send it somewhere else. Now think about the tomato fruit. A developing fruit is what is called a low transpiration organ. Unlike leaves, which constantly pull moisture and nutrients upward through the process of transpiration, a growing tomato fruit does not transpire strongly. It relies heavily on consistent water pressure from the plant's vascular system to receive its calcium. The leaves, which transpire much more actively, will always draw calcium first. The fruit sits lower in priority. This means that during any period when water flow through the plant slows down, whether from dry soil, irregular watering, high heat stress, or root damage, calcium stops moving efficiently toward the fruit. The leaves and stems are still receiving what they need because they pull it actively. But the fruit, which is slower and more passive in the system, starts missing its calcium supply. The tissue at the blossom end, which is the farthest point from the stem, is the last to receive water and nutrients. It is also the first to show the damage when delivery falls short. This is why blossom end rot appears at the bottom of the fruit rather than the top, and why the outside of the tomato can still look perfectly green and healthy while the internal damage is already beginning underneath. The plant is not starving for calcium in a general sense. The fruit is simply not receiving a consistent enough supply, because the water that carries that calcium is arriving unevenly, and that unevenness almost always comes back to one source: the watering pattern. So what does the actual watering mistake look like in real life? It does not look like neglect. Most growers who deal with repeated blossom end rot are not ignoring their tomatoes. They are watering them, their tomatoes. They are watering them, but the pattern is inconsistent. The soil dries out significantly between watering sessions, and then the plant receives a heavy dose of water all at once. This cycle, dry period followed by a flood, is one of the most common ways tomatoes are watered, especially by growers who are trying to do the right thing. The problem is that during the dry period, water flow through the plant slows sharply. Calcium transport slows with it. The fruit, which is in active cell development during this window, begins to experience a calcium shortfall in its tissue. The cell walls in that blossom end tissue, which depend on calcium for structural integrity, start to break down. This damage is often already underway before any visible symptom appears on the outside of the fruit. By the time you see the dark, sunken patch, the internal damage started days or even weeks earlier. Then the heavy watering arrives. The plant rehydrates quickly. Water rushes back into the system. But now a different problem begins. Rapid water uptake after a dry spell can cause the fruit to expand unevenly. The skin and internal tissue can split or stress under the sudden pressure. The fruit that was calcium-starved during the dry period and then flooded during the wet period shows the worst outcomes. This pattern is also why blossom end rot often appears mid-season rather than early in the year. Early in the season, the weather is often cooler, the soil holds moisture longer, and the fruit is still small. By midsummer, when the fruit is growing rapidly, heat is pulling moisture from the soil faster, and many growers are watering less frequently than the plant actually needs. The conditions for blossom end rot are at their worst. The timing is not random. It follows the watering pattern almost exactly. If you are growing your tomatoes in containers or in a raised bed, you are working with a naturally higher risk situation for blossom end rot. And the reason comes back directly to moisture consistency. Ground-level garden beds have one significant advantage that most growers do not appreciate until they start growing in containers. The surrounding soil acts as a moisture reservoir. Even after the surface dries, deeper soil layers often hold residual moisture that roots can access. Ground-level beds also tend to experience more gradual moisture changes. The soil does not go from wet to bone dry in a single afternoon. Containers behave very differently. A pot, even a large one, has a limited volume of growing medium. In warm or hot weather, that medium can dry from moist to critically dry within 24 to 48 hours. The root zone temperature in a pot also rises much faster than in the ground, and heat accelerates moisture loss dramatically. Small or dark-colored containers in direct sun can stress the root system of a tomato plant within a single hot afternoon, even if the plant was watered that morning. Raised beds sit between ground beds and containers in terms of risk. They hold more volume than pots, so they dry more slowly, but they still drain more freely than in-ground beds and can experience rapid surface drying in summer heat. If the raised bed has a shallow depth, less than 30 centimeters, it behaves more like a large container than a true garden bed, and the moisture swings can be just as sharp. This is the overlooked point I mentioned at the start of the video. The growers who struggle most with blossom end rot are very often the ones growing in containers, growing in shallow raised beds, or growing in fast-draining sandy soil, because all three of these situations naturally produce the moisture inconsistency that disrupts calcium delivery. Adding calcium to the mix does nothing to solve the underlying structural problem. The soil moisture pattern is what needs to change first. So what does the correct watering approach actually look like? The goal is not to water more. The goal is to water consistently enough that the soil in the root zone never swings between extremes. The plant should never be sitting in waterlogged soil, but it should also never be allowed to dry out to the point where water flow through the vascular system slows significantly. Maintaining that middle range consistently is what protects calcium delivery to the fruit. In practical terms, this usually means watering deeply and less frequently, rather than lightly and daily. A deep watering that reaches the lower root zone encourages roots to grow downward where the soil holds moisture longer. Shallow daily watering, by contrast, trains roots to stay near the surface where soil dries out fastest. A tomato with shallow surface roots is far more vulnerable to moisture swings than one with a deeper, more established root system. For container tomatoes, check the moisture level of the growing medium rather than watering on a fixed schedule. Push a finger or a moisture probe several centimeters into the mix. If it feels dry at that depth, water thoroughly until water flows from the drainage holes. If it still feels reasonably moist, wait and check again in 24 hours. In hot weather during peak fruiting season, containers may need watering once daily or even twice on exceptionally hot days. The container size matters too. A larger pot holds moisture far more reliably than a small one, which is one practical reason to always choose the largest container your space allows when growing tomatoes. For raised beds and in-ground beds, drip irrigation or soaker hose system set to run on a reliable schedule is one of the most effective practical tools available to home growers. It removes the variability from the equation. The soil receives steady, consistent moisture regardless of how busy the grower is, how hot the day was, or whether it rained slightly and the grower assumed the tomatoes were fine. Consistency is the single most important word when watering tomatoes during fruit development. Even with a good watering rhythm, there is another layer of protection that makes a meaningful difference, and it costs very little to implement. Mulching around your tomato plants is one of the most practical things a home grower can do to reduce moisture swing and protect against blossom end rot. A thick layer of mulch on the soil surface, typically around 7 to 10 centimeters for garden beds, slows surface evaporation significantly. On a hot summer day, an unmulched soil surface can lose moisture rapidly within hours of watering. A well-mulched surface holds that moisture far longer, giving the root zone a more stable, consistent environment between watering sessions. Organic mulches such as straw, shredded leaves, or wood chips are all commonly used and generally effective. They also gradually break down and add organic matter to the soil, which over time improves the soil's moisture-holding capacity. Soil that holds moisture well does not require perfect watering precision from the grower. It provides a natural buffer that reduces the impact of a missed watering or an unexpectedly hot afternoon. Soil quality itself plays a supporting role here. Soil that is rich in organic matter, good compost, aged manure, quality potting mix holds moisture more evenly than thin, sandy, or compacted soil. This does not replace the need for a consistent watering pattern, but it does mean the plant has a more forgiving root environment to work with. A tomato growing in nutrient-rich, moisture-retentive soil will tolerate minor watering inconsistencies far better than one growing in fast-draining, low organic matter growing medium. For container growers, choosing a quality potting mix that is specifically designed for vegetables or tomatoes makes a practical difference. Some mixes include moisture-retaining particles that slow drainage slightly and provide a more stable moisture environment. These are not miracle products. They work best in combination with consistent watering, but they do add a layer of resilience that thin, cheap mixes simply cannot provide. Together, mulch, soil quality, and consistent watering form the three-part foundation of blossom and rot prevention that actually works in real growing conditions. Let us bring all of this together, because the full picture here is more useful than any single tip on its own. Blossom end rot appears on your tomatoes because the fruit tissue at the blossom end is not receiving enough calcium during active cell development. But the reason that calcium is not arriving is almost never because your soil is missing it. The reason, in most real growing situations, is that your watering pattern is inconsistent. And inconsistent watering means inconsistent calcium transport through the plant's vascular system. The fruit is the weakest link in that transport chain, and it shows the damage first. Calcium sprays can provide some topical support in the short term, and ensuring your soil is not genuinely calcium depleted is still worth checking, particularly if you are growing in containers with aging potting mix, but if your soil is reasonably prepared and your blossom end rot keeps returning season after season, the answer is almost certainly in the watering, not the soil amendments. The growers who benefit most from understanding this are container growers who are watering irregularly, raised bed growers who are relying on rainfall and occasional hand watering during fruiting season, beginners who are watering when the surface looks dry rather than checking the root zone, and anyone who has added calcium to their soil repeatedly and watched the problem return anyway. If any of those descriptions sound familiar, the fix is simpler than you probably expect. It does not require a new product or a complicated nutrient program. It requires a more reliable, deeper, and more consistent watering approach, ideally supported by a good layer of mulch and a quality growing medium. The practical checklist is straightforward. Water deeply and infrequently rather than shallowly and daily. Never let the root zone dry to the point where water flow through the plant slows noticeably. Add a generous layer of mulch to slow surface evaporation between sessions. Use the largest container size available. If you are growing in pots, consider drip irrigation or a soaker hose setup if consistency is difficult to maintain by hand. And check the actual moisture depth of your growing medium rather than watering on a fixed schedule that ignores what the root zone actually needs. None of these steps is complicated, but together they address the real cause of blossom end rot rather than masking the symptom with a product. That is the difference between a grower who fixes the problem permanently and one who treats it repeatedly and keeps wondering why it comes back. If this explanation gave you a clearer picture of something that has been frustrating you for seasons, share it with another tomato grower who might be making the same mistake. Leave a comment below telling us whether you grow your tomatoes in the ground, in a raised bed, or in containers. It helps us understand what growing situations our audience is working with. If you found this useful, click like. It genuinely helps this kind of practical content reach more growers who need it. And if you want more plant ideas that are grounded in real growing logic, subscribe to Planter Lab. We are here to help you make smarter decisions in the garden, not just more purchases. See you in the next one.